عرض كتاب النكبة كارثة أمام أعيننا لمؤلفه بيرنت هيرميل، صحفي ومؤلف، ولد في ستوكهولم السويد عام 1953. عمل هيرميل لمدة 30 عاما كصحفي. كان رئيس تحرير مجلة الأعمال الأسبوعية ومراسلا في صحيفة الأعمال اليومية. يعيش في ستوكهولم وهو متزوج ولديه 6 أطفال و9 أحفاد. يعتبر هذا الكتاب سادس مؤلف له بعد سلسلة إصداراته الصحفية. يستند الكتاب إلى 75 مقابلة متعمقة مع لاجئين فلسطينيين يعيشون في الضفة الغربية وفي الأردن ولبنان والسويد وداخل الخط الأخضر.
The idea from the book, it's a pretty long story, but I'll try to cut it short perhaps. It started actually with the book before this book, and that was called The Survivors, which was stories about Holocaust survivors, Hitler Holocaust survivors during the Second World War. And I interviewed about 120 people, Jews mainly, but also Roma people, Catholics, priests, people that socialists, people that were considered enemies of the German state. And I thought that was a good format for me, sitting down talking with people. Before the book, I have to explain, I did a podcast called The Survivors. And this is in Swedish. And that podcast later became the book, The Survivors. So I was thinking about the Nakba for several years, actually. I wanted to learn more about it. I'm not a great reader. I'm more of a listener, a bit of a talker. And I didn't really know how to approach the subject. But because of this earlier project, the Holocaust project, the Survivor project, I figured, hey, doing a Nakba podcast, maybe that's the way to do it. And so we did. I got financing from a businessman and from the Olof Palme Foundation, the Prime Minister, Swedish Prime Minister that was killed. So we got off, started doing interviews in Sweden mainly, with all of them Nakba survivors, of course. Different ages, men, women, so on. And from there, the project grew. And we were publishing, or I was publishing a podcast with all of these talks. Sometimes it was like maybe 45 minutes, sometimes it was 2 hours or 3 hours, depending, you know. And then we expanded the whole thing, and first I went to Lebanon, to Beirut, and I met with poor people, with rich people, with people in the camps, Burj al Barashne and Shatila, but also in very fancy villas. And there I worked with a local photographer, and she was Mona Bibi, she was also my interpreter. Then from Lebanon, a few months later, I went to Jordan, also working with the local photographer, Shireen Anish, and she was also my interpreter. And the same thing, rich people, poor people, but all of them Nakba survivors. And then last year, I went with my friend, Kato Lane, who's a Norwegian-Swedish photographer. We worked together on the Survivor project, and he's been with me in this project, both in Sweden and in the West Bank. So we went to the West Bank, and a little bit also in Israel proper, so I guess that's what you call it. And from those 75 interviews, podcast interviews, I made that into a book. And this is the book, Nakba, Before Our Eyes, Catastrophe Before Our Eyes. And it's in Swedish so far. So that's a little bit about the background. So, what is the book about, you may ask? And it's the simple answer is it's just stories. It's people stories, it's talks that I sit down with people. We have a cup of coffee, we laugh a little bit, we cry a little bit maybe in the end, and in the meantime there is a story that I want to listen to. And I'm not interested in the big picture, not in the big politics, but in the small questions. You know, where were you born? How did your room look like? Did you have any toys? What kind of kid were you? What were your parents' name? What were your siblings' name? And so on and so forth. So I stay a lot on the ground. I walk around with these people in their memories, and then things start. There is an American journalist, ستوكهولm. He doesn't live anymore. He was famous in the States in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And he had a talk show, a daily talk show. And he was considered like the master interviewer of that time. And he said once, the secret behind a good interview or a good conversation, there are three key elements to that. And he said was listen, listen, listen. And if you really are curious and listen actively, meaning that you listen but you also put questions, you know, what did happen, why did it go, you know, have a lot of detailed questions, but basically because you're interested, you're listening. And then he said, ستوكهولm, if you do that for a while, people get the feeling that they are listened to, that you're interested in their lives and what happened to them. And then ستوكهولm says, and then the story unfolds. And this is very true. You start out with a lot of questions, but as you go along for an hour or 2 hours or whatever, you don't need to put so many questions anymore, because the story unfolds. And you see it like more or less like a gift from the people that are telling you about their lives. So that's my basic philosophy. Of course, I interviewed some official people, some PLO officials, or that were warriors together with Arafat and this and that. But I'm not really interested in the politics. I'm interested in what they were feeling, what they were dreaming, if they have any nightmares today, or what their longings are today, if they regret anything, and so that's sort of I find maybe this is a stupid thing to say, but usually I find women better suited to tell stories the way I want to hear them. And men, not always, but quite often, are more interested in the big picture, in how the troops were moving, or how the war went this way and that way. And that's not really what I'm after. A lot of other people are doing that much better than I do. My idea is if we can have a conversation that affects me emotionally, the chance is pretty good that the people who are listening, or in this case reading the books, also will be affected. And I think that's true. So this is, I could quote a few things in the book that maybe give you a feeling what kind of stuff there is. There is a couple of long stories, but mostly there are quite short quotes. And I put them in along a timeline. So it starts before the Nakba in the 30s, then you have up to the Nakba, then you have the Nakba 48 or 47, 49 perhaps. And then you have 56 maybe, the Suez War, and you have 67, Six-Day War, and this and that. And up till today, because as you know, or most of you know, or some of you know, the Nakba is ongoing. It's not like the Second World War that was 39 to 45. This is a process that's been going on for more than 75 years. If you're not a good study, I'm not. I don't read. I read books, but when I start to work, then I read the books. I don't start by reading books. I start by meeting people, talking with people. And the first lesson, and then you get a lot of lessons from talking to people. And one of the first lessons was, I was interviewing an 80-year-old woman. I wasn't sure how clear she was in the head. You're not always sure about that when you start a conversation, right? So I started by, after a few formal questions about her family situation, where she was born and what year, this and that. I said, okay, so can you tell me about the Nakba? And I'm only interested in what you heard, what you saw with your own eyes, not hearsay, not second sources, this and that. So she answers immediately, what Nakba? What Nakba do you mean? So I think to myself, this woman already is in the fog. She's not clear anymore, and this is going to be a difficult conversation. And I said, well, I was thinking about, well, the Nakba 48. Because before I started this project, I was thinking of the Nakba as a specific date, a specific year with a start and an ending, not the ongoing. But her question was really, do you want me to tell you about the Nakba 48, the Nakba 67, what happened yesterday, and so on. So she taught me immediately that my frame of thought, or whatever you want to call it, I wasn't in the right place for this project. So that was one of my first lessons, that this is an ongoing project. And for example, this is a woman called Hayat Dawood Muhammad Al-Kawasmi. Maybe I'm not doing the right pronunciation, but she has this quote in the beginning of the book. This is one of the first quotes which I find interesting. She says, I'm not afraid of the Jews, but I'm afraid from the whole world because they turn their eyes on what's happening here. And I thought that was a pretty interesting statement that this woman said. So that went into the book. And I have seven longer stories, and then there are these shorter quotes. And this is, now I'm jumping because this is, this is not along the timeline, so to speak. But this is also very interesting. Say, this is Samia Nasir Khoury. She was born 1933 in Jaffa, and we recorded this in Al-Quds. She says like this, the Israelis have lost their chance. I belong to the last generation that knew Jews as human beings and neighbors. The younger generation only know them as soldiers and occupiers. And for me, that was a mind-blowing thought, because usually you think of the occupied as the victims, right? Which is true, and the occupier is the one with all the power. But she turned the tables completely by saying this, that, hey, they lost their chance. They have a problem. I thought that was pretty cool. And here is a little longer. This was recorded in Uppsala, that's outside of Stockholm in Sweden. His name, he doesn't live anymore, unfortunately. His name is Asad Amia, and he was born 1934 in Haifa, in Palestine. And this is part of a longer story, and I got very fond of this man because he had such a soft way of telling his story and all the drama that he was involved in. And this is just a little piece of that story. It goes like this. I was 13 years old and worked in a cafe in the center of Haifa. The owner's name was Siegel. He spoke only German. One of my workmates was Johanan. We became friends. One day, Johanan was hit by a British military jeep. The driver was drunk. Johanan was taken to the hospital, but he died after 4 days. I wanted to go to his funeral, but I couldn't because I had nothing to cover my head with. In the Jewish funeral graveyard, you have to cover your head, right? I stood at the entrance of the graveyard and cried. Is it your brother? A man asked. No, it's my friend, but he was like a brother to me. The man gave me a kippah, to put on the head, with the Star of David, so I could go to his grave. And maybe I can have a few more, a bit shorter quotes. These are two. This is from Shatila camp in Lebanon. This is by Nabea Hamad Abu Yamous. She was born 1939 in Amka, and we recorded this in Shatila. In Shatila camp I wake up every morning broken and tired. In Palestine everything felt holy, even the sand. The smell of the cucumber moved my heart. I think that's a great poetry in that sentence. The smell of the cucumber moved my heart. Palestine is my lover. Very sweet woman. And this is Fatima Abdelrahman Shteti. She's born 1937 in Haifa. And we recorded this in Sundbyberg, that's a suburb to Stockholm. And she explained of all the hardship in her life and how miserable things had been. Of course, when she came to Sweden, the life was a bit better, but still a lot of problems. And then all of a sudden she says, of course, I'm hopeful. The Turks were with us for 400 years before they were forced to leave. So that kind of time frame I find very interesting. And it's true, all empires sooner or later crumble. It's just a question of when. Maybe a last quote I could read for you. And this is Adnan Abu Ude, who I met in Amman, in Al-Urdun. And he has a more of a philosophical take on the Nakba, but for me it was very interesting, and the first time I realized that what he said was very relevant. His quote goes like this: Nakba has three dimensions. Firstly, we lost our homeland. Secondly, we became refugees. Thirdly, we were forced to turn away from the Mediterranean and its civilizations. In Palestine, we had been neighbors to Greece, to Italy, to France. When that border to the Mediterranean was closed because of the Nakba, we were forced to turn eastward and southward, to the south. We were forced to orient ourselves to the desert. That's the deeper meaning for me of the Nakba. I get angry when I think about it. I would like to forget it. That's Adnan Abu Ude. And that's the Nakba book. And it's filled with these kind of, sometimes it's a bit humorous, sometimes it's very heartbreaking, and a lot of wisdom coming from these people that you learn a lot from. Yeah, so people sometimes ask me, what do you want with this book? What's your aim? Will it change anything? Can it bring peace and stuff like that? I don't think in those terms at all when it comes to my work. Firstly, I write for my own pleasure, curiosity, interest. That's what drives me. I'm basically, I think, a self-obsessed person, and I do what interests me, and that's why I do it. But also I understand, I learned through the years, I'm 70 years this year, so if something interests me, it's a good chance that it interests more people. So I'm pretty confident that if I find tracks that I follow, people will be interested in going in those tracks. But usually I think of it like this: what's the aim? Why do I do this? What do I hope to achieve? I think of it as, if I can affect one person only, that will change that person, maybe not completely worldview, but affect a person on a little deeper level, then I'm content. Nothing more than that. And already, this is a new book just a couple of weeks ago, and already now I got extraordinary, it wasn't a letter, it was a messenger from a guy that I never spoke, I don't know him, he doesn't know me. But he had read about this book, my background, I'm Jewish, people say, how come you're a Jew? I did the book on the Holocaust, why do you do a book about the Palestinians? And for me it's very simple, because I'm Jewish but I'm not a Zionist, so it's not a complicated question. If something is wrong, it's wrong. So it's interesting. But he wrote me a long message saying that he had a lot of, I don't know the word, he had a lot of bad thoughts about Jews. Prejudice, I guess, was the word I was looking for. He blamed all the problems in Palestine. He's not a Palestinian, he's a guy that was born in Iraq, in Baghdad. But all the problems in Palestine was the Jews' fault, and the Jews are this, and they are rich, and they control the media, and all of this bullshit. And he became more and more radicalized. Then Daesh happened, and he said, he's a Muslim, this boy, and if they are Muslims and do these terrible things, so that sort of shook him a bit, and he understood he had to reevaluate his thoughts and feelings and thinking. And then he learned about my journey, what I had been through, and what I was doing, and he said that changed his worldview, maybe not, but his feelings, and he understood that he has to be to have a more humanistic approach to life, not be an extremist. And that made me, that made this book worth 2 years' work, So I already achieved my aim. And I mean, it's sometimes people, you're a Jew, what do you think about the occupation? I mean, how can you not be, if something is wrong, it has to be right. You have to change it. And for me, it's not a complicated question at all. There is an occupier and there are occupied. There is the power structure is completely clear. There's one that calls all the shots, and people in general that has no right. I mean, they don't even control their own space. They can, the Israeli soldiers can come knock, preferably at night, and take away their sons with blindfolded. And I mean, just that detail of the whole picture is against the UN Charter. You are supposed to control your own space, your living space. No one else is entitled to go into your apartment or your house. So it's not a complicated question. The occupation has to end. How the solution is, I don't know. I'm not a politician, I'm not a big thinker, but I know it has to be changed.